The results of Ontario Student Voices on Sexual Violence Survey are out, and China's jaywalking policies reach new extremes. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. Last year, the Ontario provincial government launched a post-secondary wide survey to better understand how students felt about sexual violence, and I believe this was something that was much needed. There was a lot of thoughts and preconceptions about sexual violence, but getting hard evidence to really document how students feel about things and what things can be improved on was much needed. This survey served to bridge the gap between the two, and it was great. It kind of took a little bit of time for them to compile the results because they had to do things like data scrubbing, which meant basically getting rid of troll responses. But now it's been released and we're here to go through it with you. The first thing to really keep in mind when dealing with data like this is that this survey was a convenience survey, which means that the odds of bias are relatively high. You can picture it in a different framework to better understand the concept. Let's say you had a terrible experience at a restaurant. You are probably way more likely to write a review about the restaurant now because you've had a bad experience, as opposed to if you had an okay experience. You're not really motivated to do anything. And the saying is true for both sides of the extreme. If you had a really amazing experience, you're more likely to write a review. So the same concept applies to this survey. It was voluntary. There wasn't really a reward for doing it. The people who were most motivated to do the survey were ones who had strong feelings towards it. And that doesn't mean that people who didn't really have strong feelings or personally went through anything didn't take part. It's just a matter of the frequency of the respondents. And there's even a clause in the summary report making sure you're aware of that. The results of the data might not necessarily apply to every student out there, but they did have a relatively large sample size, so we can conclude with some sort of confidence that the data isn't completely skewed, and it should serve as a fairly representative sample of Ontario post-secondary students as a whole. If you want to break down the numbers, they had about 813,000 respondents from the university sector. They had about 293,000 people from college, and 28,000 people from private colleges also respond to the survey. So all in all, pretty good numbers. Let's look into it. The survey was broken down into 5 buckets that they really wanted to explore deeper, and I can say that I agree with them. They really encompass the issue as a whole. So the first one was the perception of consent that the respondents had. The next was their knowledge of sexual violence supports, and that really translates to how well aware they were of the resources they could use if they ever encountered a sexually violent act. The next thing that they wanted to look at was the experiences of sexual violence that the respondents took part in or were a part of. The next was the satisfaction with institutional responses to sexual violence. That really only applies to people who have actually gone through something where they've experienced sexual violence firsthand, and how they responded really to the institutional support that they had towards these people, these victims. The next thing that they wanted to respond was the last thing, behavior of bystanders. That's if you were a bystander and you saw something happen. Like, let's say you were walking down the street and you saw someone being sexually assaulted or someone becoming the victim of sexual violence. They wanted to know what you did and why you did that or why you did not do that. If you've taken a look at the data, you would realize something really strange right off the bat. What the government decided to do was amalgamate the data into those buckets I just mentioned to make it more readable to the users, and so you wouldn't be spending hours going through each individual question looking at the ratings. But I think they played themselves. This was a major misstep, and I'm going to explain why as we go on through the data, because there's going to be a real-life example of why it doesn't work out when you do things like that. The first bucket they had in the report was the Perceptions of Consent Index. So what this was there were a couple questions about consent, and what they did was take the average of all of those questions and combined it into one figure, and it became an index. So a couple of the questions they used were things along the lines of, consent does not need to be given at each step in a sexual encounter. The respondent would respond with strongly agree, strongly disagree, or whatever is in the middle. And a couple other questions were, consent for sex one time is consent for future sex. Mixed signals can sometimes mean consent. If someone invites you to their place, they are giving consent for sex. If you and your sexual partner are both drunk, you don't have to worry about consent. So basically, the crux of most of these questions were that if you strongly agreed, you would essentially be saying that these circumstances would now require you to give consent. And if you strongly disagreed to these situations, you would be saying that you think that you would need to ask for consent regardless of the situation presented to you. And as a result, when amalgamated, the data was pretty good. So within the university sector, 90% of people strongly disagreed. So with those examples, mixed signals can sometimes mean consent. If someone invites you to their place, it means you got consent. 90% of university students disagreed with that. They believe that there is something more that has to be given to you in terms of consent before you actually do assume you can have sex with the individual. And that's amazing. That's where the number should be. It could even be higher, but 90% is a great figure for that because that's how it really should be. A lot of these things don't necessarily imply explicit consent. There's a lot of assumptions that go into making it. So it's really good to see 90% of the university populace who responded to the survey can recognize that. Then we look a little bit deeper into the figures, and a remaining 7% didn't agree or disagree with the statements. They were in the middle, which means they were unsure. And only 3% strongly agreed or agreed with the situations presented. So here's the thing. So here's already the first time when you see why amalgamating the data was a terrible move. And I was unable to find the results of the individual questions when I looked for it. All you actually have to work with is the amalgamated data. So 3% of individuals strongly agree or disagree. Okay, but with which of these statements do you think that applies to? Because it's hard to tell which one may have led to this 3% agree or disagree. When you amalgamate the data, sometimes there's responses in that kind of skew things. So for example, something like consent does not need to be given at each step in a sexual encounter versus if a person doesn't physically resist sex, they have given good consent to you to continue. You can't tell which one of those two was the reason why someone may have put strongly agree or disagree. You're kind of forced to make a general assumption based on the entire bucket as to why someone said that. And this is going to be even more applicable to the next bucket. But so basically the summary of that first one, perceptions of consent, only 3% of people surveyed thought that these examples were okay as consent, which is, I think, a good thing. Only a very small minority of the population are willing to assume consent from very inexplicit situations. And if you look at the college figures, the number has sadly decreased a little bit. 84% of them strongly disagreed with the statements, 10% were unsure, and about 5% of them strongly agreed. So the numbers are a little bit worse for the college sector. And if you look at the private college sector, numbers are way worse. It drops down to 82%, and 7% of them strongly agree, and about 11% neither agree or disagree. The next bucket deals with knowledge of sexual violence support services and reporting procedures. Once again, it's an index, and within that index, it was a couple of questions like these. I understand how to access academic accommodations related to sexual violence. I understand how to access supports, for example, counseling, health services, housing safety, and security service related to sexual violence. I understand the formal reporting options at my university, college, private, career college, etc. I know how to file a formal report regarding an incident. And based on those questions, the university sector responded with 60% strongly disagree, 17.9% neither agree or disagree, and 22.4% strongly agree. So within this context, the strongly agree is what you were aiming for, which would indicate to you that your students strongly agree that they know about these services and know where to turn to if they need help for sexual violence. Given the results, almost 60% of students strongly disagreed, which indicates that they are unaware. And here comes again the problem with amalgamation. If you amalgamate the data, it is almost impossible for you to pinpoint where you have to improve upon. 60% of people say disagree. Okay, so how can you make it better? You can't if you amalgamated all the data because you don't know if question A was the problem, question B was the problem. You can't pinpoint if it was the academic accommodations, if it was the security services, if it was the filing a report section, because everything is lumped together. And as students, we don't know what to advocate for because the data is all lumped together. It was a terrible move, honestly. Like, all we can really do with this data is make general assumptions and guess where we have to improve upon. So my call to the Ontario government is to release the individual responses so we can see. Like, if you have a question like I understand the formal reporting options and 90% of people strongly agree with that, then you know it's not something that needs major attention. But if only 10% of the population who did the survey said they agree, then you know it needs major improvement. But because everything is so together, we can't extract these knowledge strands from the data set itself. It's impossible. So I guess all we can do is talk about the results, but they're not really meaningful in that sense. The best possible thing you can do from the data set is identify broad sectors where improvement is needed, but you won't know how to go about administering that improvement with a really concrete knowledge set of where exactly things have to be improved upon. But it's okay. At least we're building a framework here and we're getting a general idea. So we said 60% of university students strongly disagree, but you go to college and only 48% of their people disagree. 21% were neither or, and 30% strongly agree. That's almost 8% higher than the university sector. So from that, we can make a general assumption that the college sector is doing something right. Maybe there's something to learn from them. And you look at the private college sector, and the numbers are amazing. 28.9% strongly disagreed, but 47.5% strongly agreed that they knew about these resources. Almost half of the population was aware. So there's something to take from that, and at least it revealed that to us, that the university sector needs more attention with getting their resources out and available, and the college sectors are doing pretty good in general. Next index we have to look at is the Sexual Harassment Experience Index. So in that bucket, there are questions like you were treated differently because of your gender identity or orientation, you were put down, or someone was condescending to you because of your gender identity, someone tried to talk to you about sexual matters that you didn't want to talk about, someone told you a sexual joke that made you uncomfortable, someone continued to ask you for dates, drinks, or dinners even though you said no repeatedly, someone touched you in a way that made you feel uncomfortable, stuff like that. So basically a wide array of things that are considered sexual harassment and how the respondents reacted to that. And how the respondents reacted to that was based on responses like never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. So they were forced to document, well, they weren't forced, it was optional, but they were instructed to document how often these occurrences happened to them. So within the university sector, 63% of people responded with sexual harassment experience was disclosed. So 63% of people experienced some form of sexual harassment and 36.8% did not. In the college sector, it was way less. 49% of people had experienced sexual harassment of some sort and 50% of people did not. In the private college sector, it was even lower. 29% of people said they did and 70% of people did not. And here comes, once again, the problem with amalgamation. Some of these sexual harassment experiences are far more grave than others. Like the way they bucketed it, there's no weighting to the different options. They've taken things such as someone making a joke to you that made you uncomfortable, the same as someone physically touching you. And being rational, we can acknowledge those two things are not of the same magnitude. So I don't know if it paints an accurate picture here. And that's my problem with the data set. My next problem, it's the way they have combined everything. It kind of makes it hard to tell exactly how severe the issue is, because they have things that are less severe lumped with things that are very severe, like someone touching you when you don't want to be touched versus someone saying something to you or asking you out on a date repeatedly. Like, don't get me wrong, all these things are bad and they're not wanted, but the degrees of badness are not the same, and they're kind of presenting it as if they are. And it would be way more valuable if we could see which one of these things are more problematic than the other, such as if your rates of sexual harassment that involve physicality are extremely high in universities, that's something that needs to be fixed. But if these figures are getting pushed up by things like people making inappropriate jokes around you, that's still an issue, but it doesn't need the same level of fast action as a mass epidemic of physical sexual harassment happening on campuses. So honestly, it was a good report, but just the way they presented it needs a lot of work. And I'm basically going to be able to keep parroting this to you for every bucket because the same issue arises. So I'm just going to stop doing that and let you guys just come up with why it's bad according to that bucket yourselves. So the next bucket we're looking at is the Stalking Experience Index. Now, this is really creepy, getting stalked before. I don't know if you guys have dealt with it, but You just kind of know when someone's staring at you and they're mimicking your movements down to the T. And you know those scenes in the movies where you'll pause and they'll pause, and then you'll make a sudden movement and they'll make one? It kind of actually goes down like that in real life. It's pretty crazy. So the questions that were asked in this bucket were things such as, were you watched or followed from a distance? Has someone approached you or picked up pieces of stuff to show you from the ground or something like that, so trying to make contact with you? Has someone left gifts or other items for you that made you feel uncomfortable? Has someone sneaked into your home or car? That's crazy. Like, oh, okay, I'm going to break my promise. I'm going to talk about it again. So taking someone like that, someone breaking into your house or into your car, is in the same bucket as someone like giving you a present. What the fuck were they thinking with this? Honestly. And anyway, so the next question that was part of the bucket, like, were you cyber stalked? And funny enough, within like millennium culture, cyber stalking is something that's not taken too seriously. I feel like, how many times will your friend tell you, oh, you gotta look up this person because they're really attractive, and like, you will basically stalk them on Instagram and look up all their pictures and stuff like that. As long as you do it in a way that doesn't infringe upon that person's right to privacy, then it's become kind of a norm, honestly. Like, obviously there's extremes. If you DM them or start liking all their pictures, like basically being creepy. Like, be smart. Be smart when you're doing things like that, because there's actually a line. It's a very thin line that can be drawn between something that's really intense cyber stalking and something that involves you looking up someone's profile and seeing their pictures because you think they're cute. So just be careful with that, guys, because now it's becoming a problem. Within the university sector, only 23% of people experienced stalking, 76% did not. Within the college sector, 23%, 77% did not. So very identical numbers. It seemed like stalking grounds aren't particularly more attractive in university versus college. Everyone gets the same percentage. And in private college, once again, the number is lower following the previous patterns. Only 12.3% of people experienced it. 87% did not. So the next bucket is pretty severe. It's non-consensual sexual experience index, and this involves things like someone fondled, kissed, or rubbed up against you when you didn't want them to. Someone tried to have oral sex with you when you didn't want them to. Someone put like their appendages inside parts of you that you didn't want the appendages to be inside, and like things like that. It's really disgusting. If you have to go through that personally, it's really terrible. Like, someone basically force themselves upon you physically in ways like this. And let's look at the numbers. So within the university sector, 23% experienced non-consensual sexual encounters. That's terrible. That's almost 1 in 4. 77% of people did not. And oh my goodness, once again, amalgamation. Look at the first one. Someone fondled, kissed, or rubbed up against you. If you ever gone to a club, people are going to rub up against you, especially if you're a girl and like a soca track comes on. And it's in the same bucket as someone putting their fingers in your private parts or your ass. So, you know what I mean? Like, doesn't that skew the numbers a lot? Like, how many people have been rubbed up against? I would say a lot of people. And if they put yes to that, it's going to drive up the numbers of people who have experienced non-consensual sexual encounters. That's why they needed to break these down further. It's just too vague. Moving on to the next category here, it was satisfaction with the institutional response to sexual violence index. So this is for people who actually experienced sexual violences and how their campus treated them, how it cared for them, and how it handled the situation. So the criteria for that was, first of all, they believed you. The next thing was they took care of you academically, give you accommodations. They met your needs for support, whether that was counseling or health services, stuff like that. And looking at the numbers, the university sector said 22% of them were very dissatisfied, 17.8% were neither satisfied or unsatisfied, so they were impartial to that. And almost 60% of people were very satisfied or satisfied. In college, almost the exact same breakdown. And in the private career colleges, it's once again slightly better. 67% of people were very satisfied. So yeah, interesting data set. We need more people to be satisfied with the service that they're receiving if they are sexually harassed. But where do we improve? The age-old question. We don't know, because everything's amalgamated. We don't know if the problem was the counselors or people not believing them or any of the 1,000 things that are part of the process we can't pinpoint. Terrible. Now we move on to the final category, the behaviors of bystander index. So this basically has to do with how the respondents reacted when they're in a situation where they became bystanders to sexual violence. And the questions are things like, you asked someone who looked very upset at the party if they were okay. You tried to distract or intervene when someone was being physically abusive to someone else. Stuff like that. Like, it's a whole variety of things that could have happened that relate to sexual violence. And if you've seen it, how did you react to it? And the way it breaks down to is, in the university sector, 25% of people have never witnessed a sexually violent act. 75% of people did. And from that 75% of people who did witness it, 70% of them intervened, 30% did not. In the college sector, it's pretty, I don't know, I'd say it's fairly better actually. So 32% of people did not witness anything, 67 did witness, but if you look at the intervention numbers, it breaks down to be roughly the same. 69.4 did something, 30 didn't. So it looks like to be a pattern. If you're in a situation where something's happening and you're relying on bystanders, there's about a 70% chance that a university student or a college student will help you, and a 30% chance that they won't. I wish it was 100%, but like, it's hard to assume why they didn't, because people will attribute cowardice most likely, but we don't know the context of the situations. It's very vague. So it's hard to make judgments upon the people who did not, because there's very valid reasons why you yourself would feel uncomfortable to intervene in a situation like that. And that pretty much sums this up. All in all, it was very enlightening. If you're interested, I highly suggest looking up the file. It's posted online. The Ontario government has it on their website. And it was a great initiative. There were just some things they could tweak. And maybe next time they do it, they'll get me to advise them. So moving on to our final topic of the day, it's actually a story that one of my peers showed to me last night. It was a documentary showing China and some of the radical procedures that they've adopted recently. And this one was particularly crazy to me. So they were interviewing these Chinese residents who were from abroad, and they were telling them the craziest things that are happening in China nowadays. And this one completely blew me away, honestly. So this individual decided to jaywalk across the street one time, and he gets by. 20 seconds later, a notification pops up on his phone. You've been caught for jaywalking. Here is your ticket. And they automatically withdrew the money from his WeChat account. He didn't even have to approve it. It was automatically taken out. The government literally took the money out. They had proof. They sent him the picture, and that was that. No questions asked. Like, no chance for you to appeal the decision. That was it. And on top of that, if you walk past the traffic light, there is a monitor screen that acts as like a wall of shame. It shows the pictures of the people who were recently caught jaywalking, and it's like a slideshow, so it keeps on going, and people will see that, and they'll see you, and they'll think you're some type of scum of society, and you'll get that label. And to me, that's pretty crazy. Like, that's dystopian, because if you look deeper into it, it basically means the government knows exactly where you are at all times, because they have cameras literally everywhere. At every intersection, every street, there's a camera. And it's so advanced that now you can jaywalk, and 30 seconds later, you're getting a fine, all the money's getting taken out, and you're getting your face on that beautiful wall of shame. Like, how crazy is that? And it made me think, like, how would America be if it was a communist society? Like, sometimes I feel like we don't truly appreciate how much a force for good democracy really is for us. Like, you take that concept, you already know that would never fly in the West. There are too many human rights violations that go on with that, and we're lucky to have those things. And there's people around the world right now who are going through a whole different type of lifestyle, and to them it's normal. It kind of blew me away, honestly. Like, just the amount of power the governments have over there. It's literally crazy. So that about wraps it up for today's episode of the Perri Platform. I'll see you soon.